Remembering is not a fixed innate ability, it's a skill you can learn. In fact, there are many proven and easy ways to improve your memory. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about remembering things through mnemonics and how they can be used to learn Chinese. Forgetting is, of course, the nemesis of language learners. You hear a new word in a podcast and look it up, but when you encounter it again later, you have already forgotten what it means. And learning Chinese characters feels like trying to hold on to water. You scoop it up and you hold it for a moment, but if you do nothing, it slips away through your fingers. How can we forget less and remember more? There are two major answers to that question. The first is spaced repetition software, which we talked about in episode 290, and the other is mnemonics, which is what we're going to talk about in this episode. So mnemonics are basically clever memory techniques that allow you to remember more, and it really is that simple. There are techniques you can employ that will allow you to remember much more than if you don't use these techniques, and some of them are also easy to learn. I'm going to use the word mnemonics a lot in this episode, and it is of course spelled MN, but the initial M is silent in English, and that's because it's from ancient Greek mnemonikos, meaning relating to memory. Most mnemonics rely on the mind's ability to notice and remember connections between things and events, and if you know how this works, you can create connections that are easier to recall. In essence, by linking things together in vivid and memorable ways, remembering them also becomes easier. For example, if you want to remember water, sheep, and ocean, and this will be relevant later, repeating these words together over and over only works in the short term or if you repeat them an absurd number of times. So try this instead. In your mind's eye, picture a giant sheep wading across the Atlantic Ocean, wool wet and dripping with water. If you make this image vivid, it is much more likely to stick for a long time. Mnemonics have been known about for thousands of years, and yet they are still either unknown for most people or just frowned upon by the public in general, thinking that they are cute tricks but that are not actually that useful. Just to give you an example, here are a few things anyone can do quickly with some practice. Remember a large number of objects in a list in order. Memorize a deck of cards, or 10 if you prefer. Commit to memory as many pin codes as you want. Naturally, it's possible to do some of these things without using specific techniques, but using techniques, these tasks are actually quite easy. There are people who compete in trying to remember things, and you might think that people who win such competitions are savants, born with some fantastic ability to remember things, digits of pi, playing cards, Rubik's Cube, or whatever you prefer. But that's not the case. These techniques can be learned by anyone, and yes, that includes you. My goal in this episode is to convince you that remembering indeed is a skill you can learn, and that there are many ways to improve your memory, and that matters for learning Mandarin. However, there's only so much I can do in one episode, but fortunately there are other people who have tried to do the same thing, and the best example in my opinion is Joshua Foer, who has a TED Talk, link in the show notes, which is well worth watching. If you prefer to read, you can also check his New York Times article, or you can read his book, Moonwalking with Einstein, which is available in Chinese as well. So the too long didn't watch or didn't read version is that Joshua Foer was a journalist covering memory competitions. He thought that the people who participated in these competitions, and perhaps particularly those who won, were savants, as I mentioned. They had some magical, innate ability to remember things, and he wanted to understand this better. It turned out that they relied mostly on learnable skills, and he tried to learn as much as he could and participated himself, and ended up winning the US Memory Championships, proving that remembering is indeed a skill you can learn. So why do mnemonics work? Well, learning is largely about connecting things that you want to learn with things that you already know. The human brain has evolved to be very good at noticing certain connections. So, for example, connecting the color pattern of a mushroom to later disease or the sound of an animal to danger is vital for survival, and so we're very good at these things. In essence, things that stand out and are not normal tend to be easier to notice and thereby also easier to remember. Can you recall what animal was wading through the Atlantic Ocean earlier? Depending on what you want to memorize and why, there are many different techniques you can use, and so this is a brief overview of some of the principles. First, we have association and linking. So as mentioned, the brain is well adapted to notice and remember certain connections. Not just any connections, of course. The more they stand out, the more absurd they are, etc., the easier they are to remember. So make sure that connections you make stand out. Number 2 is visualization. Both a poisonous mushroom and a dangerous animal are tangible objects. So to hijack the mind's ability to remember, we need to make it as real as possible. People differ a lot in how vividly they can visualize images, but this is about making them feel real, not creating a high-resolution mental image of something. Number 3 is stories and events. Humans are also very good at remembering stories as a series of connected events called episodic memory. And if you want to remember longer chains of objects, connecting them together to form a story can be very powerful. Number 4 is locations. There are many mnemonic methods, such as memory palaces and the method of Loki, that rely on your ability to recall physical locations. By mentally placing what you're trying to remember in a familiar, known location, you can then recall that object or that thing by revisiting this location. This works really well for memorizing things temporarily and is very popular in memory competitions. Finally, as number 5, we have pegs. It's hard to create vivid connections between things that don't mean anything or don't have a concrete meaning. So, for example, as mentioned, mushrooms and animals are tangible objects, so visualizing them connecting to each other in some way is not very hard, but to connect the number 8 with the word freedom is trickier. A peg, then, is something that you use instead of the abstract thing you're trying to memorize. So, for example, instead of memorizing the number 8, which is abstract, you create a peg, maybe a pair of sunglasses. And when you want to memorize the number 8, you use sunglasses instead. So the pin code to the garage door at work is not 8368. It's sunglasses, camel, cable car, sunglasses. And this is much easier to connect into a story or to remember vividly compared with 4 random numbers. Such peg systems can be very complex, and the more you plan to use them, the more it makes sense to actually develop them further. To illustrate this, it's perfectly fine to use an item like sunglasses to represent the number 8 and do the rest for the numbers 0 to 9 if you want to remember occasional pin codes. But if you're going to memorize, say, thousands of digits of pi, this won't really work. It's much more efficient then to extend the system and have one peg for every number from 0 to 99 instead of to 9. This creates 100 pegs, which takes some time to learn and get used to, but on the other hand, you also halve the number of images you need to remember. To connect this last point more directly to learning Chinese, we do need to remember many things that are very abstract, such as tones and pronunciation. For example, the first tone or second tone don't mean anything on their own, so what you need to do if you want to memorize these using mnemonics is to use a peg system. And a very simple one would be to associate each tone with an element. So for example, maybe the first tone is fire and the fourth tone is water. So if you want to remember the tones of a word like 声调, meaning tones, you can remember it as fire plus water, which is concrete compared to the numbers 1 and 4. For more about this, check out episode 243, which was entirely about using mnemonics for learning tones and pronunciation in Mandarin. The reason I've mostly used examples that aren't directly related to Chinese so far is that the main goal here is to convince you that memory is trainable and that remembering is indeed a skill you can learn. It's hard to do that while at the same time also explain how the Chinese language works, which is necessary if you want to use mnemonics for learning, for example, Chinese characters. Let's stick with that example for a bit, and if you don't know how Chinese characters work, I strongly suggest you check out my series, The Building Blocks of Chinese, and again I'll put links in the show notes. Most of the basic character components are actually pictographs of physical objects, such as, say, fire, stone, tree, etc. And these don't really need pegs because they mean things already, and the only thing you need to be mindful of here is that there could be things that mean similar things, and you need to make sure you use different images for different characters. Then, to create mnemonics for more complex characters that contain more than one component, you need to link the components in a memorable way. For example, the character for ocean in Chinese consists of, yes, you might have guessed this already, sheep and water. And if you can still recall the giant sheep wading across the Atlantic Ocean, well, you already have a mnemonic for this character. Then for compound words, you can essentially do exactly the same thing. So in Chinese, computer is 电脑, so 电 here is electricity, and 脑 means brain. This is already kind of a mnemonic in and of itself, but it doesn't hurt to make it more vivid by thinking of electrodes being stuck inside brain tissue and giving off sparks or something like that. Naturally, not all components and characters are this friendly to creating mnemonics. Some of them do have abstract meanings, and then you need pegs. For more about this, check out the article How to Create Mnemonics for General or Abstract Character Components. In a follow-up episode to this one, I'm going to talk more about concrete ideas for using mnemonics to learn Chinese, but here I will just share some general thoughts and reflections after having used mnemonics to learn Chinese, among other things, for over 2 decades. So first, I want to say that mnemonics can be a stepping stone. So if you have created a mnemonic for something, this is not the end of learning, but rather a step along the way. This is definitely true for most mnemonics you plan to use for spoken Mandarin because they are too slow to recall in a conversation. Well, it could work if it's only one word occasionally, but you clearly can't rely on clever visualizations and associations to come up with every single word you want to say. But you don't need to, you just need to do that occasionally when you forget something, and gradually you will become familiar with more words and your fluency will increase, and you will no longer need the mnemonics you once created. We actually talked about this in episode 291 if you want to learn more about mnemonics being too slow. Next, I think mnemonics are almost uniquely suited for learning Chinese characters. This is not only because we have more time, so speed is rarely an issue. It's okay to take some time before you come up with how to write a character compared to coming up with a word in a spoken conversation. It's also because characters have inherent meaning and structure, and you can use that to remember them. I also want to say that the combination of mnemonics, understanding how the characters work, and exposure to them over time can be very powerful. While I think sometimes you can come up with a mnemonic that really sticks for years, and even if you don't see the character or write it, you can still recall it many years later, but this is probably not the norm. Finally, I'd like to point out that even though mnemonics are powerful, you shouldn't use them for everything. Coming up with mnemonics takes time, and if you were to memorize everything you could learn about a specific character, including its meaning, how it's written, how it's pronounced, including tones, etc., the mnemonic you create for each character would be very complex, and you'd spend a lot of time just coming up with these mnemonics, revising them, forgetting them, trying to recall them again, etc. Whereas you should probably use most of this time just reading and listening to Chinese instead, and use the mnemonics when you really need to. This is also a point I expanded a bit in episode 229. Before we wrap up this episode, I'd like to say something about how I came into contact with mnemonics. And this happened almost exactly 20 years ago when I studied psychology at university. It wasn't part of our syllabus, but a classmate of mine recommended a book about memory techniques that I devoured and then applied to everything I could. I also experimented with family and friends, trying out different techniques and seeing how easy it was to teach others how to use these techniques to remember, well, basically anything you want to remember. I also got interested in Rubik's Cubes, and after having done that for a while, I found a guide online that claimed that anybody who has some basic competence with the cube can learn to solve it blindfolded in 1 week. And this sounded impossible to me. I mean, not that people could solve the cube blindfolded, I knew that people did that, but to me that sounded like a Herculean task that would take years of practice, and that there would be too much to memorize and then trying to visualize everything on the cube, etc., etc. I thought it was impossible, and a week was way too short. Still, I was young and optimistic, so I tried, and after almost exactly 1 week, I successfully solved the cube blindfolded the first time. This was my Joshua Foer moment. It was something I thought impossible, and yet a week later I knew how to do it. Still later, when I started learning Chinese, I of course tried to use the same principles for learning characters, etc., and this turned out to work really well. So the goal of this article was to convince you that memory can be trained, that mnemonics work, and that they can be used for learning Chinese. I realize I haven't said too much about using it to learn specific characters, different types of characters, etc., but this is something that I will cover in an upcoming episode. Until then, you can browse a full list of articles related to memory and mnemonics on Hacking Chinese by checking the written article linked to in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.